Today we're going deep into the mind of our equestrian compadres. One of the biggest challenges for us humans in understanding how a horse's brain works is that we have a frontal lobe and a horse doesn't. The frontal lobe is the biggest part of the human brain, and this is where we plan, strategize, and do a lot of analysis. Our brains can go back to something we learned a long time ago and connect the dots. For example, when you leave home, if you leave home, life kicks you in the butt a little bit, you start to grow up, and you think back on lessons you learned from your parents and realize how smart they were. That's a good example. Horses can't do that because they don't have that frontal lobe. Sometimes we think our horses strategize against us or feel spiteful, or they're just intentionally ignoring us and refusing to learn. But their behavior towards us is actually a combination of their emotional state, evolutionary or hardwired traits, and learned behavior, whether we taught them intentionally or not. So examples of hardwired traits are things like hardwired fears. Examples of these are restriction, confinement, darkness, narrow spaces, sudden movements, unfamiliar sounds, predators, and isolation from their group. All these things are going to trigger a horse's fear, and when a horse experiences fear, adrenaline and cortisol levels rise, and a horse's fight or flight response kicks in. I've actually noticed various levels of sensitivity to each of those hardwired fears based on breed and bloodlines. And because horses are built to run, fear typically induces a flight response where they try to put distance between themselves and what they see as a threat. Occasionally, some horses will have a fighting response kick in, especially if they feel restricted or confined. Now, for a horse to be an effective companion, we do have to help them overcome these fears. Teaching them to overcome them is kind of one of the first building blocks of any training program. If a horse can't handle dark or narrow spaces, they're not going to load into a trailer. If they can't handle sudden movements, they aren't going to be safe to be around and shoe. If they can't handle any level of restriction, a rope around the saddle horn when you're branding is going to be hard for them. Steve Peters says if a horse doesn't feel safe and their adrenaline and cortisol levels are high, it's nearly impossible to teach them anything. So in order to really teach them, we have to help them face some of those fears so they can be in a place where they don't feel threatened. We bring those adrenaline and cortisol levels down and really help them start learning when they help them overcome those fears. We'll do a separate video on some exercises that help horses confront each of these hardwired fears. But for now, let's take a break to hear from a word from our sponsors, which we don't have yet. Maybe someday, though. Now, the cerebellum is the portion of the brain that stores movement information. A horse's cerebellum is quite a bit larger than a human's, and in biology and physiology, parts of the brain that are larger usually denote more intelligence in that area, which is definitely the case here. A newborn foal can run an hour after it's born. We humans take months or even years to do that. Horses are incredibly intelligent when it comes to movement, and I actually think our inattention to our own movement as humans is one of the primary things that keeps us from being good teachers with our horses. So if we can exercise Marcus Aurelius' advice to be strict with ourselves and tolerant with others, in this case our horses, we're going to be better teachers. When we teach a horse a new movement and leave them alone, the areas of the brain that lit up while they were learning continue to light up and solidify what we just taught them. This is why we talk about pressure and release of pressure and why it's so important to apply and release pressure at the right time. A lot of times we'll continue picking on a horse over and over again, but the problem with that is it doesn't give the horse time to hardwire that information, and a lot of times it just ends up with both of us being frustrated. So for example, if I'm working on flexion with a colt and I hold their head in flexion for too long after they've given it to me, they start to try other things to get away from that pressure and don't internalize what we're trying to teach. So I try to use a 3-second cap as the cutoff for when I apply and release pressure, depending on what I'm trying to teach. And the more responsive you can get your own movements, the more responsive your horse is going to be. So to maximize a horse's ability to learn, we need to do the following. Help them overcome hardwired fears, pay really close attention to your own movements during training, and make those movements consistent. Give them an environment where they feel safe, because this keeps adrenaline and cortisol levels lower, makes them more trainable, gets serotonin flowing, which solidifies learning in this emotionally balanced state that we get them in, or try to get them in. There are a few outward manifestations of a horse being in this state. Their heads are lowered, they're licking and chewing, stuff you've probably heard from other trainers before. Number 4, I'd say give them time to process the things we've taught. When your horse offers the correct movement consistently, it's a really good spot to stop and tie up your horse for an hour or two. Remember that because a horse doesn't have a frontal lobe, it can't connect the dots between pressure and release of pressure if too much time takes place between the stimulus and a rewarded response. And lastly, I would say don't work on too much at one time. If you're working on reining spins and cutting turns in the same session, it will actually take a horse longer to get good at those movements. This is probably the number one thing that I struggle with, because I find multiple holes in my horses and pick on all of them in the same session. Eventually you can work towards that, but especially with colts, you got to kind of break those up. I'll post some links in the description below for some of the content we used to make this video. If you want to dive deeper, there's a great video out there of $1 Million Rider NRCHA Nick Dowers showing us some real-world application of these concepts during colt starting, which I think are awesome. So I'll post those down in the description below. Ladies and gentlemen, if you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started, trying to produce quality content, which I think we're doing. And we could really use some help from the YouTube overlords to prioritize our videos. So like and subscribe if you'd be so kind. Happy training. Adios.